Critical Role is the piece of media when it comes to Dungeons and Dragons and actual play podcasts, but does anyone else remember the Adventure Zone? Hi, this video is mostly spoiler-free in regards to the plot of TAZ Balance and the details of each adventure in the campaign. There are minor spoilers for certain character details, but I don't dive too deep into the story in this video. So this is safe to watch if you have not finished Balance or are interested in listening to the podcast but just haven't gotten around to it yet. The Adventure Zone, also referred to as TAZ, was my gateway into Dungeons and Dragons and TTRPGs in general way back in 2017. With it being a pretty low barrier to entry since the actual players on the podcast were not super well versed in D&D themselves, only having played a couple of times or never in the case of Clint McElroy. You can imagine how that created an environment that was not super intimidating for people who were interested in learning more about D&D. And yes, I am very well aware that TAZ takes a more silly and loose approach to the rules, so some would see it as a not great introduction to D&D and its mechanics. But I think that lack of intense rule following is what made it a more digestible D&D experience for newcomers like myself. Get invested in the concept of role-playing games and the basis of the environment and flow most people play D&D with, and now you're primed to actually learn the rules when branching out to other D&D media or playing your own game. It's been 7 years since I got into the Adventure Zone, and after all of this time, I keep coming back to their first campaign, Balance. The way the world was crafted, starting as a joke, then turning into a beautiful exploration of human connection, the way the characters grew into themselves as everyone got used to playing, the way the characters in the universe basically discovered themselves as time went on. There was a charm to Balance that hooked myself and many others in, and the campaign has since occupied a space that none of the others have really touched for most listeners. Today, I want to take a look back on the Adventure Zone from its conception to what made TAZ Balance the golden child to the vast majority of the audience.
We may need the heal slots. We're definitely not going to need a corpse.
So you're saying we eat him?
But I'm saying, no, what?
No, wait, no.
The darlings of late 2010s internet weirdos. I say this with the utmost affection because I too am and was an internet weirdo. The McElroy family made their impact with a handful of podcasts and quirky vibes that people just ate right up. Starting in 2011 with their joke advice podcast, My Brother, and Me, often shortened to Mabimbam, Justin, Travis, and Griffin McElroy grew an audience with their wit and charm. There's an appeal to watching or listening to people be friends, or in this case, close siblings. The way that they joke and the way that the listeners are brought in on the jokes makes for a very fun, parasocial experience. For 30 minutes to an hour, you're hanging out with the McElroy Brothers as they crack jokes, build bits off of one another, and just have a great time conversing. Honestly, I kind of just described the appeal to basically any online content creator. But one thing that the McElroy Brothers had that worked in their favor was not only their chemistry as brothers who got on well, but they also fostered a positive and fun environment and enforced this safe space in their live shows as well, commonly referred to as the no bummers rule in the fandom and community. And their humor was less based on making fun of different groups of people and more based on either joking about themselves or the humor in absurd situations.
I can't arrest a fucking dog. Hold up. Yo.
I think that dog...
Yo. Furries can do infinite crime.
Which, to my understanding, was pretty different in the early and even mid-2010s internet culture. In a video essay titled The Politics of the McElroy Brothers, the creator puts it really well when she compares the humor in Mabimbam to South Park. Both franchises make fun of authority in what's often referred to as punching up, but the McElroy Brothers go out of their way to not punch down and not make fun of marginalized groups, or topics that are too serious and too important to joke about. It's through this approach to humor that a lot of people found a welcoming and accepting community. People from all walks of life could enjoy McElroy content without feeling excluded or othered. As someone who was there for the major McElroy love of the late 2010s, I do believe that is the biggest reason why they were so beloved across the internet. Silly, quirky humor that didn't exclude anyone. No, the McElroys were not perfect by any means, and they would make mistakes, but they're human, and for the most part, they did their best to correct their behavior when called out, so there was not a drive to cancel them or consider them anything other than relatively good people. Over the years, the McElroy family has created many podcasts, and at this point have created their own independent network. Although they may not be as widely beloved, there's still a dedicated community there. But for the scope of this video, we're only going to look at the Adventure Zone podcast and the community centered around that podcast specifically. Although it should be noted that at the height of its popularity, most Taz fans also delved into the other podcasts, because the McElroys had us all in a chokehold, and there were a lot of fun things going on during this time, like the Mabim Bam TV show, and we just had a good time.
Way to persevere.
We can't take these. This is
Totally can.
No,
Listen.
I keep staring at Taco.
No, listen.
I don't blink.
Insurance will cover this. It's
No,
fine.
listen. It's a bank.
This is a victimless crime.
We're not looting.
FDIC will cover this.
We're literally stopping a bank robbery.
I keep staring at Taco.
Just because you found money in a bank doesn't mean that you can just take it with you.
I put the
I'm
money in the bag for
staring.
safekeeping.
Great. I grabbed some chairs. I grabbed furniture. Why are we looting? This isn't a dungeon. People do business here. Put that back.
Listen, the government's gonna pay this back.
Nobody's gonna do anything. You're gonna get arrested. You'll go to jail. We're literally talking to the chief of police. He's outside.
He would do this if he were here. The
No, you know
corruption
what?
in the militia?
Magnus, I think he's right.
Nope.
Of course I'm right.
Let's put the chairs back and let.
You guys can split it 50-50 if you want. I swear to God, first thing I do when I get outside is I rat you out. I'm writing it on my goddamn character sheet.
The Adventure Zone initially started as an experimental episode of My Brother, and Me in 2014, done as a filler type of thing when Justin took paternity leave. They also brought in their father, Clint, to act as one of the players. Later that year, the Adventure Zone went from being a little thing they did on Mabim Bam that one time to a full-on separate podcast that aired bi-weekly. The Adventure Zone has many different campaigns and does not just stick to Dungeons and Dragons. Full transparency here, I took a break from listening to Taz for a long while, and I'm still making my way through Ethersea, which is the 4th long-running campaign. So this video is not going to have too much insight into the later campaigns. But here is a quick rundown of each of the main campaigns. And I say main campaigns because there are little tinier bits that they do for live shows or exclusive paid content and just little things here and there. First, we have Balance. The OG starts as a pre-written D&D adventure, but then evolves into a greater original story where the gang recovers special items and eventually uncover their past connections with each other, the organization they work with, and the mysterious red robes that they were told to stay away from. And of course, the universe-ending threat that they must work to overcome. Commitment! Introduced as a mini-campaign and played through the Fate system, the main premise being that the players were part of a group of average people brought in by a company to be given superhuman powers. Amnesty starts as a mini-campaign. Amnesty was played through the Monster of the Week system, and most fans agree that it's basically the McElroy version of Gravity Falls. The main location is a small town in West Virginia, and there are cryptids that have entered the world through a stone archway that connects the normal world with this world full of creatures. Fighting monsters, solving world-ending issues, your standard affair. I personally love this season. It was handcrafted for me specifically. Ignore the fact that the McElroy Brothers don't even know I exist. Dust. This season also started as a mini-campaign and was later brought back. It's played through the Urban Shadows system. Dust starts as a murder mystery, and the second season is a heist. Both seasons seem to be mini-campaigns between bigger ones. Graduation! We are back in D&D 5th edition for this one. It's a boarding school for heroes and villains and their sidekicks. The players are all in the sidekick program. That's basically the main premise. It's how the campaign is introduced, and for the first bit of it, that's kind of all that's going on. I don't want to spoil where the plot goes in the event that someone watching this video hasn't listened to or finished Graduation yet, but it does get kind of big. But we'll talk a little bit more about Graduation in a minute. Ether-C. Ether-C is neat because there is a prologue bit that's played in the Quiet Year system, and then later moves to a homebrew version of 5th edition D&D. The official summary of this one reads as follows. Travelers from 4 war-torn kingdoms congregate at the edge of a fearsome storm, following a divine invitation emanating from the deep within, the Ether-C. I am still making my way through this campaign, so, there is that. I'm not super far in, but the adventures that I have heard are very exploration-based so far, and combat makes use of boats, which is pretty cool. I do enjoy it. Steeplechase. I've not gotten to Steeplechase yet, but I have heard it's got a similar charm as early Balance. Many fans have this, oh, we're so back vibe when talking about Steeplechase, and it seems to be really well liked. It's played using the Blades in the Dark system and takes place in a world that's made up of different layers of theme parks. The premise being that the players are theme park workers that run an underground operation that uses holographic technology to provide other workers with a luxury experience. Is Hatsune Miku in this one? I feel like I'm gonna love this one when I get to it. Outra Space. Outra Space is a mini-campaign that is actually a continuation of War of the Realms, Journey into Mystery, a Marvel comic originally written by the McElroy family, which is pretty cool. The system used is Marvel's old multiverse role-playing campaign. I've not read the comic, nor have I gotten to this one, so that's all you got from me on what Outra Space is. And finally, we have Versus Dracula. And this is the current campaign at the time of making this video. Versus Dracula is back in 5th edition D&D, and the basic premise is that they are a group of vampire hunters seeking to kill Dracula. This just got started, so I've not seen a lot of conversation about how good it is or what people think about it, but it sounds kind of fun. But I might just be in my vampire phase because of Baldur's Gate. These are the main campaigns from the Adventure Zone podcast, though. As I mentioned earlier, there are other mini adventures done for live shows, events, or exclusives behind paywalls. So that's not like a full scope of everything they've ever done, but these are like the main campaigns, basically, or like mini campaigns that they have. But despite there being 9 main campaigns, most fan discussion at large is about balance, even all these years later. A lot of fan works and cosplays are still related to Balance. Balance is the arc that has a graphic novel adaptation, which is still in the process of making its way through the story, so I don't know if they're going to adapt any of the other campaigns, but I do feel like Balance was the lightning in a bottle moment for Taz, and so we're probably not going to get any other adaptations, but don't take my word for it. You never know. It is worth noting that most of the live shows in the past years did stay within the Balance universe, even during other long-running campaigns, but I do believe that is no longer the case for live shows. Either way, though, it is very clear that Balance had been the main focus for a while, and it makes sense. But why, after all of these years, do fans keep coming back to Balance? Why is that the preferred campaign? Taz Balance is the first campaign, the original. It's where Taz got their start, and it's also the fan favorite, as I have said. The vast majority of fans that I saw online, even today, enjoyed the following campaigns, but they all felt that nothing hit as hard as Balance. And a lot of us lost steam through Graduation and either dropped the show entirely or slowed down a ton. I think I finally finished Graduation around February of 2022, and for context, Graduation wrapped up April of 2021. I was like a year late, basically. This video is not going to focus on critiques of Graduation. There is a very in-depth video that unpacks why people disliked Graduation pretty well, so I will link that down below if you are interested. But the gist of it, way too many NPCs, to the point that they were impossible for fans and the actual players to keep up with, and fans made up their own NPC. If that tells you anything about how that was being handled. Also, world building and pacing did fall a bit short, and many fans just didn't like Travis's DMing style, which, fair enough, different people are going to have different storytelling methods and they're going to do things differently, but people were also put off by the poor attempts at representation and the insensitive and bad portrayal of things that seemed to call back to Native Americans. The story also had some issues, and the players were not given the freedom to impact the narrative, which is kind of a staple of TTRPGs. It's a collective storytelling activity, and players don't want to feel like their actions don't matter. And Graduation made it to where the players' actions didn't matter. It's also worth noting that around the time Graduation was airing, fan perception of Travis was starting to shift to a more annoyed and negative one, so all of that comes together and makes Graduation a bit of a slog to get through, especially a slog to get through as it was airing. While I do think that is a huge factor in why a lot of people kind of stopped listening to basically anything that wasn't Balance, looking at why people didn't like Graduation does not tell us why everyone loved Balance, and why Balance has had a greater lasting impact than any of the other campaigns. At least until recently. I did mention before, but people seem to really love Steeplechase, and it's too soon to really judge versus Dracula's reception and impact. First and foremost, I do think a factor as to why Balance is regarded as highly as it is because it was the first. Nostalgia for the era of our lives in which we first listened to Taz Balance, and the excitement of this silly niche podcast gaining more popularity. The high of finding new interests and nostalgia for the community that used to be so visible. Yes, the fandom still exists, but I remember in 2017, there were a ton of Taz cosplayers at my local cons and multiple meetups throughout the weekends. Now, not so much. Fans are lucky if there's even one meetup that's organized. Taz fans are now in their own cozy corners, and you have to be more intentional when looking for them. They used to be everywhere, and now they're not, pretty much. But it can't just be nostalgia that keeps Taz Balance held in such high regards. What about its story resonated so strongly with listeners? The story summary is as spoiler-free as possible while still getting the gist of the journey. But I am assuming anyone watching this video is either interested in listening to Taz or has already listened to it and doesn't really need the story summary. But either way, the Adventure Zone Balance is a campaign that starts as a simple delivery mission gone wrong. It's established pretty quickly that this is more of a misadventures kind of story, because that's just more comedic, and what are the McElroy Brothers here for if not being funny? However, through this delivery mission, our main trio become involved in a bigger plot to collect dangerous relics across Faerun. The rest of the podcast follows their adventures working for a mysterious organization on the moon called the Bureau of Balance. Tracking down and recovering these relics, each an item that tempts a person into using it and basically unleashing chaos, each dangerous when fallen into the wrong hands, and quite frankly, any hands are the wrong hands. Throughout these adventures, and through hints and items found in between adventures, we slowly uncover that our main trio has a mysterious past that's unknown even to themselves. And whatever lies in their past may be connected to what they're doing now, and the elusive red-robed figures that they were warned to never go near. This overarching mystery is what ties everything thus far to the world-threatening finale, and also what allows for the characters to be expanded upon in a way that cleverly incorporates the established backstories from early on, while also allowing for the gaps to not feel like plot holes, but instead feel like intentional lapses that work with the bigger plot. Despite us knowing for a fact that that was not planned when the players made up their characters. I think to understand why people loved the story of TAZ Balance so much, we need to take a look at the main characters, primarily the main trio of player characters.
We go back a long ways, right?
No, we don't. We met 2 months ago. My name now. I'ma getcha. I'ma getcha like a fish.
Your name, of course, is Taco.
Okay.
Psych, that's just mine. Say my name. I cast Magic Missile.
Starting with the flamboyant elf that I and so many others got into this podcast in the first place for, we have Taco Taco. Yes, his name is just Taco spelled differently 2 times. But Taco is a silly guy. Played by Justin, Taco starts out pretty much as a joke, his main role in the story being the witty wizard. He's a trickster and frequently irritated, and an ex-TV star. But he's lovable because it's played for humor. And I just think Justin is really good at character voices, which elevates the enjoyment of all of his characters, even when they don't have much going on. Like the Fearbulk in Graduation. But as the story goes on, Taco becomes more than just that funny wizard guy who used to be on TV. As he says himself, he's a multi-dimensional being. He is a fully realized creation.
I have a beating heart. I'm multi-dimensional. I'm a fully realized creation. Fuck.
At the start of Balance, Taco is played as dumb because Justin thought it would be funny, but as the story goes on, Taco shows his intelligence more and becomes an integral part in how the group finds out what's going on. This has led to the read that Taco just plays dumb to gain an advantage, and to be fair, that fits his personality really well. Also, like, if you're a wizard, you kind of have to have high intelligence because that's the stat you use to cast your spells. Not that you have to build a character that's, like, functional in D&D, because believe me, I really want to play a bard character that has, like, low charisma and is bad at being a bard. Like, that is funny. But it makes more sense for Taco to be smart, because he's also, like, good at magic. It's also just really funny to see how the joke characteristics that Justin initially gave Taco were integrated into a more well-rounded character. Since Taco's name is, well, Taco, they did joke that his main quest was to discover what a taco was. That translated into Taco being a chef and having a cooking show, and even operating as group chef when he was in the iPre group. I'm not gonna spoil anything, but the, like, discovering a taco bit does come back towards the end, and the payoff is so good. I remember it being such a cool bit. So it's just kind of fun how they had that full circle moment. It's also joked about, like, in the very first episode, that Taco is from TV. And it kind of becomes like a thing he says. He's like, yeah, I'm Taco from TV. But since televisions didn't actually exist in their universe, and the McElroy Brothers take a very typical medieval fantasy world-building approach, the Taco from TV idea was reworked into Taco doing traveling shows called Sizzle It Up with Taco, where he'd travel from town to town doing his show. That is, until his food was poisoned and killing all those who attended his show. It was a whole big thing. And it's honestly really intriguing how this plays into Taco's story. It's his biggest regret and the moment that was used in an attempt to persuade him to use one of the items that they're hunting down. Go back and fix his biggest mistake. Except Taco learns that it wasn't his carelessness that caused the food to be poisoned. He didn't do that. Instead, the food was poisoned by his assistants. In Taco's eyes, all the blame is no longer on him, and that's all that matters. But when you actually look at what happened, his assistant poisoned the food in response to Taco's self-centered nature. He's an incredibly selfish character. The assistant, Sazed, or I think that's how it was said, I don't remember. But anyway, Sazed had traveled with Taco and learned to cook along the way and wanted to become a bigger part of the show, pretty much. He was turned down, though, and Taco claimed it was due to merchandising, but in reality, Taco just didn't want to share the spotlight. which, fair. We see this time and time again through the entire story that Taco is a very selfish person. He does things for his own amusement and enjoys mocking others. But that's not to say he's incapable of making genuine connections with the people around him. Taco does not care about showcasing cruelty to those he doesn't know and care about, but he is incredibly empathetic and loyal to those that he trusts. His friends, his family. Taco has a lot of walls up, sure. He had a rough childhood, passed around until he ended up hitting the streets with the one person he did have, his twin sister, whom he doesn't even remember existing until the final stretches of the story. Taco has been abandoned over and over again. He craves connections and even deals with the perils of his job because he's afraid no one else will have him. He doesn't share his vulnerabilities often because opening up is just not his style. It's hard and requires a great deal of trust, but he is capable of loving and caring for others, even if others have to grow on him first, like in the case of Angus, who went from being that annoying kid detective to a kid Taco proudly mentors in magic. Like, Angus is basically Taco's child. Not at all like that, but also kind of like that. Watching Taco grow out of his shell and become a fully fleshed out, multidimensional being was a very rewarding experience for fans of this silly idiot wizard. The way that the story evolved around Taco and we slowly learned more about him also fit pretty well with his character. As he grows more connected to the other characters and the listeners, we all get to learn more about who he is at his core. Kind of like making a relationship with a real person. You don't come out of the gates knowing everything about a person. You have to get to know them first. You have to get comfortable, build up a relationship before you start learning all about their backstory. And in a way, like, that's kind of how Taco's character developed.
Because you know
Don't
why?
you want to be a conductor?
I want to be a... Well, first of all, I'm an engineer.
But don't you want to be a conductor? Isn't that your dream? Look
No,
at
an
your heart.
engineer is on a way higher pay grade than a
Yeah, but I mean, it's a lot more responsibility too.
I'll tell-
Why
I know
you
it should
saying to me
be- you
earlier
know what I-
that you were stressed out?
On the flip side, though, we have Magnus Burnsides, a guy who's confident in who he is and a character that Travis knew a lot about from the get-go. As a player, Travis had a pretty clear idea of who Magnus was supposed to be, and he had a very genuine approach to building this character. And because of this, there's a lot less growing into who he is as a character than with Taco. But that is not to say that he doesn't have growth or go on a journey. One thing that sticks out to me about Magnus's character that I find really beautiful is what Travis says in the finale. This isn't like a spoiler for anything, but that's just where this comes from. But he says that Magnus is a guy who was searching for a cause to die for. But along the way and through his connections with Taco and Merl, he found a reason to live for. At the start, Magnus was a hero looking to sacrifice himself for the greater good. He'd recklessly rush into any danger, ready to fight off any threat. Magnus rushes in is literally what he's known for throughout the entire campaign. There's also the added element of Magnus looking forward to death, looking forward to seeing his dead wife again in the afterlife. But this man has found the beauty in living again after losing his wife and his home. He finds the joy in connecting with others and the fulfillment of helping others and experiencing life. Magnus is a very subtle look at grief, or maybe it's not all that subtle, but it's buried under the comedy of Taz. At the end of the day, Taz is more of a silly, haha, goofy bits kind of thing, and a lot of things in this podcast did kind of start as a joke, but behind the goofs, Magnus is grieving. He's living only to reach the end, to reunite with his loved ones in the afterlife. Each of the main trio are grieving a past they can't remember, but Magnus is also grieving for a home he remembers having and losing. Grief is a very hard and human thing to go through, and I would imagine it's even harder to deal with when you don't even know what you are grieving. But on the other hand, not knowing what you're grieving makes it easier to ignore, easier to push it away. If you don't know what you're missing, how are you going to engage with feeling sad about missing it? At most, it just feels like a vague sense of there's something missing. Magnus, though, remembers very vividly what life and love was like with his wife. He still remembers the hurt of returning to that vacated village, of losing everything. He remembers the anger, the pain. He's able to dwell on his grief for his wife, for his home, because he can place these feelings, and he knows exactly what he's missing. Swapping up gears here a little bit, throughout the podcast, Magnus is more outwardly friendly than Taco and seemingly less silly than Merl at times. It's honestly pretty interesting how he's got this perception of being very kind-hearted and more of a heroic personality, because when I was looking back over stuff to make this video, Magnus is just as goofy and asshole-ish as the other two of the main trio. Like, yeah, he is kind-hearted, but he's also kind of a dickhead. I guess that's the folk hero in him changing my perception over time. He's a very easy character to like because he's just the guy ever. Magnus is not as flamboyant and self-centered as Taco, and that makes him more of a palatable character to some listeners. Magnus is also just a guy who gets things done. He's a man of action, and it's through Magnus that we get to explore a lot of the early stages of this overarching mystery of the Bureau of Balance and the matter of missing memories. It's through his interaction with the story that we really begin to ask ourselves just who are these red rope figures? Magnus's character is the one that receives a lot of hints at being connected to the Red Robes that they were told to stay away from. It's also his character that would take more of an initiative trying to figure out what's going on. Magnus almost acts as a tool at times, but hey, what's a character if not a tool for the narrative? Magnus is the one that really spearheads the late-game investigation into the Bureau. His actions cause a ripple of things to happen and creates an environment and a mystery that's engaging for the players and listeners alike. And that's like his main thing. It's pretty easy to see why so many fans like Magnus and why they can connect with Magnus, and people just like characters that get things done, that get things moving. And also, the more involved a character is in the main plot, usually the higher stakes are for them, or like, it hits hard in a way that is very fun as a listener or an audience member.
You find joy. I've found joy, honest to God, getting to know you. I've found joy playing chess with you. I haven't enjoyed, getting my ass killed, but I find joy whatever I do. I don't always do things right, and I don't always do things smart, and I don't always do a character voice, but whatever I do, I find joy in it, because at the end of the day, that's all you got.
Finally, we have Merl, the silly cleric who's less God-fearing and more vibes-based. Merl is an interesting case because Clint really did seem to have a very heartfelt and earnest attempt at making a fleshed-out character that was integrated into the world. Like Taco, Merl was initially handled in a lot sillier way, but I do believe some of that was Clint rolling with being the butt of the joke and learning how to play D&D for the first time. Cousin to the guy who hired them for their first mission, a deadbeat dad who just up and left his family after years of being unhappy in an arranged and loveless marriage, and having a somewhat complicated past with religion and his own family. We see that family is something Merl has had somewhat of a rocky connection with, but he is fiercely loyal to his found family, people he's actually made connections with and grown to love in any capacity. We also see his awkward guilt for leaving his kids and the heartache that must have put them through. But it was something he did in pursuit of his own happiness, and he doesn't seem to regret leaving his wife. He wasn't going to stay trapped in an arranged marriage where the only purpose was keeping the dwarven bloodline pure. There's more to life than that. Was it right to leave his kids? Probably not, but I do understand the desire to do whatever you can to be true to your heart. And I feel like looking at his decision to leave his wife to be happy is a pretty good summary of Merl as a character. He's a guy going with the flow and doing what he can to find happiness. He's not seeking some higher purpose like Magnus, and he's not as guarded as Taco. Merl is just existing and finding joy in the little things. He says it himself. At the end of the day, that joy is all we've got. Looking back at the joy you have, the joy you found, the joy that you brought others, Merl is full of love for the world around him and the people who have touched his life. In some ways, Merl's character feels like a stereotypical hippie, all peace, love, and plants and whatnot. How many people recognize that as a mumbo-jumbo reference? And how many people think that's just me doing a slogan and not referencing a Minecraft YouTuber? Pan is the nature deity, so it does make sense that Merl would be all about nature. Pan is the god that he's a cleric to for most of balance. Merl was also raised in an isolated, wooded enclave and was raised in a Panite community, or commune specifically. This upbringing does give Merl a rocky but relatable relationship with his spiritual beliefs and his outlook on his god. And it also kind of explains why he's so just connected to nature and basically sounds like a druid at some points. But circling back around to the spiritual beliefs bit, Merl spent his childhood feeling forced to participate in religious practices, and the way it's talked about on the podcast is very reminiscent of a Christian upbringing in the US. I guess specifically in like the southeast of the US. Sunday services, summer camps, going along with whatever your parents wanted to avoid conflict and punishment. Merle High Church speaks to those who grew up in religious environments and to those who still practice their religion or spirituality to some degree. As a cleric, he is supposed to be loyal to a god and have a touch of the divine to him. Despite his complicated feelings, Merle still seeks power and guidance from the god he was raised with, and throughout the story, there are moments where he calls for help from his god, and there are some moments later on where that god cannot answer. The struggle of finding hope in a higher being only to feel let down or abandoned is one that a lot of people can relate to if they were raised in a religious environment or have turned to spirituality during tough times. Regardless of how you feel about these topics, I know that we all know the vast majority of us are not experiencing what we think is a form of communication that is as direct and clear as a cleric speaking directly with their god in D&D and having that god directly respond out loud or through speaking to their mind the way that it happens in Baldur's Gate. So even if you do believe in a god or a higher power or some sorts, and you do believe that you can communicate with them through prayer or a form of divination, there will be times where you will still feel lost, unheard, and maybe even confused on what you're supposed to be learning from your god, feeling exactly as Merle does when he can't connect with Pan. Given that we know the McElroys are from the Bible Belt, for those who don't know, the Bible Belt is a region in the US with a very, very heavy and prominent Christian presence, many listeners tie their struggles with Christianity to this aspect of Merle. They read his relationship with his god Pan as a metaphor for a potential relationship with the Christian god, and the plot-relevant silence as a feeling of struggling with their own Christian beliefs. I've seen a lot of in-depth and very personal discussion in regards to this over the years, and it's honestly a very interesting lens to look at that character through, and one that was probably pretty intentional, whether it was directly intentional. When I said intentional there, I think what I really meant was like, that's very likely, whether that was intentional or not. For people who haven't grown up in the southeast of the US, it's basically baked into the culture, whether you're actually religious or not. So it makes sense that that's like a really good lens to see Merle through, because that's probably the lens that the McElroys see Merle through. I love how full of depth these characters are, while they also take turns serving as comedic relief. Literally, each of the main trio have their moments of being the butt of the joke, the main driving force of comedy, and in a lot of media, these comedic characters are often denied the privilege of being a fully fleshed out being, denied the depth of living because that's not their role in the story. Balance does a really wonderful job at balancing comedy and depth in a way that's pretty refreshing. Doubly so for a fan base that may have been heavily into anime and cartoons, where characters are a little bit more pigeonholed into tropes. I know the Adventure Zone is intended for an adult audience, but I also know for a fact that a lot of the fans, especially the ones around me, were also into whatever anime and children's cartoons were popular with teens and young adults on Tumblr during 2017. Stuff like Steven Universe, Gravity Falls, Voltron even. Voltron is very egregious about comedic relief characters being very pigeonholed into just being comedy and nothing else. I am aware that this is just the circle of people I was around, most likely, and the people I've encountered the most at conventions, where I interact with Taz fans the most. So this is definitely not true for every fan of Taz, but I think it is still significant enough of the fans to bring it up. There are also quite a few NPC characters that a lot of us latched onto as well. A large number of us were fans of Loop, Taco's identical twin sister, and a trans icon. It's wild how loved Loop is, considering she doesn't even show up as a character until like super late into the story, but she was hinted at a time or two before. However, it makes sense that Taco fans would also be Loop fans, considering she was a great complement to his character. Equally as large in personality, if not larger, and just as fun in very similar ways. Loop is a force to be reckoned with, and I love her very, very much. I also think that knowing of her existence doesn't ruin the first time listening experience, because I knew about her when I first started listening to it because my best friend was like, hey, I'm really into this thing, and we could cosplay the twins, and I was like, yes, yeah, I need to listen to it now. It's more about the journey of her reveal than the reveal itself, which is why I feel pretty comfortable talking about it in a video that I've said is mostly spoiler-free, because to me that's just a tiny detail. One thing about the Taz fandom is that people loved the LGBT representation that would show up sometimes. Not only did we have Loop, a very iconic trans woman, but Taco was also gay and dating a man who was also pretty cool. But there were also couples like Hurley and Salone in Pedals to the Metal, or Killian and Carrie from The Bureau. We love to see sapphic relationships flourish, pun slightly intended if you know you know. The way that these relationships were tied to the story and the queerness was normalized was pretty refreshing and honestly really nice. One point of comparison with Balance and future campaigns is in how representation is handled. With Balance, it didn't start out as a long-term storytelling thing, so things developed in a way that felt pretty natural and like there was a genuine desire to have characters with marginalized identities. However, with other campaigns, the McElroys had basically already built a platform for themselves, and they knew from the start that they were making characters and a story for a wider audience, and therefore representation would hold more importance. So we get characters like Aubrey from Amnesty, a bisexual Puerto Rican woman. Aubrey was crafted specifically in such a way that it felt more like checking off boxes in a lab to create a character that will appeal to certain demographics of people. And listen, I love Aubrey. She was my favorite in Amnesty. I love the concept of a person with magic powers that they must learn to control, and I loved her relationship with Danny. But I do understand the criticism in how her character was handled versus other characters whose marginalized identities were a part of them and not the driving force of their existence. That's not to say that there were no other good and thoughtful examples of representation. In my honest opinion, some characters or some people are better than others at writing characters, and some people struggle with performative activism, or at the very least their attempts at representation feel more performative than an actual character decision. I am not in these people's brains. I don't know what the thought process was behind making these characters, but when your character shows up and it's like, hey, look at my sexuality, hey, look at my wheelchair, it feels like it was put there specifically to get brownie points of representation than it was to genuinely want to represent. And when I say they show up and are like, hey, look at all this, it's like a a pestering point. It's not something that is just brought up once and then integrated. Like, if you've listened to Taz Graduation, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But it's this making a character and putting their differences or their marginalized identities or their disabilities on display to be maybe not gawked at, but definitely is on display to be seen, and it comes off a little disingenuous. This contrast is part of why I believe Balance is so highly regarded. The story of the Balance campaign is wonderful, but it would have been nothing without the fleshed out characters that carried it. And many of us connected with these characters in ways that we haven't really connected with characters from future campaigns. There was something raw in the stumbling around and figuring things out as they went along that hasn't been captured in the more polished campaigns that followed. That's not to say that creating characters with the idea of an overarching narrative from the start is a bad thing. On the contrary, I really enjoyed how the characters in Amnesty were built into the plot from day one, and I really enjoy how the characters from Ethersea are established with a clear idea of who they are. And basically, most forms of media is started with the story in mind. Like, it's a very tried and true method of storytelling and making characters and portraying characters. But there's also a charm in the scuffed. There's a level of relatability in having half-baked characters that become something so much more as things go on. How many of us have started a roleplay or D&D game where we made the bare bones of a character and just let them grow into themselves as we played? And honestly, I've seen the argument said that a lot of the appeal to online content creators, YouTubers, indie podcasts, basically just indie in general, or Twitch streamers, or just this category of content that is individually produced and not professionally produced, is the scuffed aspect, the lack of professionality. Like, obviously, we value quality, but there comes a point where quality isn't going to add as much as that genuine human feeling that a lot of unpolished things let shine through a little bit more. In that sense, Balance feels more like playing a game to tell a story, where some of the other campaigns feel more like telling a story to play a game. And that's not a critique, it's just an observation. I do really want to say, I loved Amnesty. I've loved all the mini arcs like Commitment and Dust. I've loved what I've heard of Ethersea. As much as I hate certain things about Graduation, I also did enjoy a lot of things in Graduation. So this is not coming from a place of dogging on future campaigns in favor of Balance, because I genuinely love most of what I've heard. It's just pointing out the differences in the campaigns to explain why people might like Balance more. There's beauty in watching a character become themselves. There's a charm to the feeling of sitting down at the table with the McElroys as they played through Balance. That is the most parasocial sentence I have ever said.
When someone leaves your life, those exits are not made equal. Some are beautiful and poetic and satisfying. Others are abrupt and unfair, but most are just unremarkable, unintentional, clumsy.
So why was the Adventure Zone Balance the golden child of Taz? Balance being the first experiment and dive into actual play podcasting for the McElroys holds a level of unpolished charm for the listeners that by nature just cannot be reproduced in their other stories. Balance has also the benefit of being the first campaign, meaning all of the others get compared to it instead of the other way around. It's the baseline for what a McElroy TTRPG experience would be like. It sets the expectations for what their collective storytelling could be. We know that they're capable of having good representation that's naturally in the story, with a person feel to it. So when an NPC's wheelchair or queerness is brought up to the point of it feeling like forced inclusion or begging for brownie points for including these things, it's disappointing, and just bad character writing in comparison. When future stories don't surpass the quality of balance, it doesn't feel as good as balance, despite it probably being the exact same level of quality. Comparison is the thief of joy, or whatever they say. But above all else, it was an incredibly intriguing story full of characters that were larger than life, learning who they were and giving us listeners things to latch onto and relate to. The way that love, grief, guilt, and regrets are all explored with the characters and the narrative are very intriguing and relatable. And there's no one cookie-cutter example of how these things look either. Everyone deals with these things differently. Taco is more private about his love life, while Loop and Barry were a little bit more open in their relationship. Merle is awkward with his regrets, while other characters have a more remorseful approach to regret. Magnus is the stereotypical revenge-driven grief, while other characters are a bit more solemn. Lucretia, the director of the Bureau, has a hidden grief and regret that are intertwined so well, and they're so complicated in a way that it's just compelling, and it feels very real to people. Every character has something to say, showcases a different facet of the human experience. Balance also just touches on things that the vast majority of people can relate to. The characters are flawed and they mess up, but they also struggle with the aftermath of their decisions. They regret their choices and actively work to correct them, or at least avoid making the same mistakes. They stumble through life and they learn hard lessons, just like the rest of us, and more so than the things that directly followed Balance. Again, I have not listened to anything past Ethersea. I'm still making my way through Ethersea, so I can't speak for anything past Ethersea, basically. But what I have listened to, Balance feels the most human. Griffin does a very wonderful job crafting the story and building up a supporting cast, but there's something in the way that they stumble their way through the start, the way that he seems to make something meaningful out of the joking start, that really appeals to me and many other listeners. The moment of realizing a joke character or a bit from the early episodes is actually a bigger deal. The payoff of it all was super satisfying in a way that following campaigns just did not deliver on. Mostly because it was planned to be more of a thing from the start, which is still good in its own right. But when you build an audience through a seemingly organic evolution from silly, one-off thing to a grand and profound story, you've got a group of weirdos who loved the journey and seeming authenticity to the experience that you lose out on when you have a story from the start. Again, not a critique. Having a story from the start is also really, really good, and how most media is made. But you can feel a difference. And I think that difference might be why people like Balance more. I think you see this in Minecraft servers as well, specifically Minecraft servers made to make content through live streaming and YouTube videos. Sure, you have really well done scripted roleplay like Empires Season 2 or other more heavily scripted stuff, but many of the Minecraft servers that have blown up in popularity did not start that way, or never operate that way in terms of Hermitcraft. Things just happen and then become more. This approach to storytelling is fun for the creators and the audience. When you go into something like a Minecraft roleplay or Dungeons and Dragons with a fully planned out narrative, there's this pressure from the start that can stifle improv and creativity. Because while Dungeons and Dragons often follows a pre-written or pre-planned narrative, you cannot script and plan for everything. It is primarily improv in nature, due to unpredictable dice rolls and player input. I guess you could script everything under the sun, but unless you are lying about dice rolls, you cannot promise things will go to plan. If I may add a little anecdote myself as someone who has dabbled in Minecraft roleplay, I had a group of friends and we started a Minecraft server with the idea of wanting it to be roleplay. And we spent so long in the planning process and trying to get narratives and get stuff scripted out that we never even started playing because we were so caught up in and so scared of what the story would be instead of just starting and letting things progress naturally. Because it's improv. Things just happen. There are a lot of things that happen in D&D or other improv things that you could never script, but they are genuinely such wonderful moments. And I think having that freedom to improv basically is really important to these group storytelling activities like TTRPGs and Dungeons and Dragons, which is a TTRPG. I don't know why I specified that. Anyway, balance is peak because it's very human, and we all love to feel connected to humanity, even if that's through a Dungeons and Dragons campaign that's seemingly beyond the scope of humanity and includes mostly non-human characters. The Adventure Zone is good. Balance is wonderful. Justice for my creepy bestie Taz Amnesty. If you like the Adventure Zone, or Dungeons and Dragons, or anime, or just other nerdy things that tend to go in this circle, you should definitely consider subscribing to my channel because I talk a lot about anime and lately Baldur's Gate. Super into all of that. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching this video. I will see you all next time. I think my next video is actually going to be a Ren Fair vlog. But anyway, that's it for me, and I will see you all in the next one, whatever that may be. Goodbye! You should also totally listen to the Adventure Zone if you have not. And if you've only listened to Balance, you should totally listen to the rest of it. You can skip graduation if you want.